Another day at the supermarket. There's got to be something to paint in this parking lot. Okay, I'll see you in 45 minutes. Well, it's 27 degrees outside. A little cold for painting in water media. But as long as I'm inside the car here, I should be able to just work through the windshield. And I've got my stuff here set up in my lap, a watercolor sketchbook. And it's primed with grayish watercolor just to knock down the white. They say that ice is made of just oxygen and hydrogen, two elements. So to paint it, whoa, I'm going to use two colors, just blue and burnt sienna. Let's see what happens. So I've got the white gouache, ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, and I might use that alizarin crimson later for the car that's parked. This is a small palette area, only about 2.5 inches by 4.5 inches, so there's not much room to move here. Now I'll start out with a cool shadow color. I'm not using white yet because I want the variations in the tone. I want it to settle in unevenly into that shadow color. It's fairly dark, it's a little bit cool, but I want it to be kind of grainy because that's the way that snow looks. And if I introduce just a touch of white, it becomes a slightly smoother color of blue without that graininess. So that's what you can do with gouache, is control the texture or the graininess by using a little bit of white. Now I also have this building in the distance. It's a rectangular shape behind the snow pile there. I'm using a brush in a stipply way, hitting the surface with the tip of the flat brush to get that texture of that concrete. Now I want that flat tone again, so I'm bringing in some more gouache for the sky. It's kind of a milky, textured paint. There's a car that's parked next to the snow pile. I need to draw in the car, and I'm going to do it with these blue lines in the chrome that's reflecting the sky behind us. And next I want to have a 1/4 inch long flat to paint in the shapes of the darks of that car. This way of painting I sometimes call painting with spots and dots, because really what you're doing is you're placing small or large shapes or dots in position, not worrying so much about line like you would if you were drawing with a pencil, but more an impressionistic approach that places light and dark shapes next to each other. The nice thing about a long flat 1/4 inch brush like this is you can paint all sorts of shapes, like that radiator grille shape or the mirror shape or the shapes that are behind the car. So I'm just putting in some spots and dots and dashes and flashes back there, building it up out of rectangles, like almost out of Legos. Now that car is anchored to the ground and the snow in front of it by a fairly deep cast shadow. I'll mix that with ultramarine and burnt sienna and lose that whole edge of the bottom of the car. More spots in the background. As I look at the snow pile, the shadow side is cool, but there's a warm edge where the light is scattering under the surface of the ice and coming out on the shadow side. So I want to keep that effect of that warm glowing light by keeping some of that underpainting color showing through. If I spend too long looking at the shadow side, I can forget that the lightest value in the shadow is nowhere near as bright as those illuminated areas in the sunlight. So let's wet that whole shadow side with water, and while it's wet I can drop in a few little dark accents for some of the hollows of the snow, just to accentuate that textural character without going too light and dark in that shadow. If I just touch it with the edge of the brush, the corner of the brush, those little blobs of color should spread out a little bit. Now you might wonder, why just use two colors when you have a whole palette full of colors that you could use and make it more rich and vibrant in color? Well, there's an argument to be made for speed, efficiency, and economy. I've only got a small amount of space, a small amount of time, and I don't want to waste a whole lot of colors. But more than that, I want to explore the range of possibilities of each of these pigments. You really learn about each pigment when you just do one against another like this. And it's kind of like composing for a piano and violin. You explore what those two instruments can do together. The only other color I've added is alizarin crimson. I brought that back in because I used a touch of that on the car to get that reddish color. These strokes are a little too light, but they'll dry darker. Gouache sometimes shifts when it dries. There's a lot you can do with just color temperature, meaning how orangey it is or how bluish it is. For those of you not too familiar with color, sometimes this relationship is called complementary. If the two colors, if you mix them together and you get gray, then the colors are seen as complementary. Not only blue and brown or reddish brown, but also violet and yellow or red and green can be used in complementary relationships. When mixing a color, my first thought is about the value. Is it light or is it dark? And then my second thought is usually, is it cool or is it warm? This limited palette keeps me in that dialogue of just warm versus cool and value, without really even thinking too much about hue. That would probably be the third thing I'd think about after thinking about value and color temperature. I think about the hue, where it is on the color wheel, yellow, red, green, or whatever. And then the final thing you think about when you're mixing colors is saturation. Now whenever you paint toward the light, you're dealing with less overall chroma or saturation or brightness of the colors. The colors are grayer than they would be if you're painting away from the light. In fact, if I switch the camera around in the opposite direction, you can see how colorful all the cars and trees and the sky are. But in this direction, everything organizes mainly according to value, with lighter things farther back. And anything that's in shadow is a fairly deep shadow. So ultramarine blue and burnt sienna are completely adequate for painting a subject like this, since I don't need to get into brighter colors. If I did need to, if I was painting away from the light, then I could use more full chroma colors. All these branches lend themselves pretty well to painting with a dry brush effect because I just want the texture of the branches. I can't paint every single individual branch. So by splaying out the tip of the brush and then spreading it out with somewhat dry paint on the fibers, I can get that texture that sort of simulates the look of the branches against the sky. This is part of the fun of painting for me, is trying to look at nature and all its complexity and variety and trying to think how I can translate what I'm seeing into something the brush can actually accomplish, whether it's dry or wet or just a whisper of pigment on the brush or loaded with juicy pigment. The character of the branches and the leaves here, the character here is blobbier evergreen foliage. So I have a wetter brush and I'm moving it kind of randomly. I try to let my hand and fingers have their own mind. I was reading that an octopus has a brain at the base of each tentacle, and every tentacle has its own personality. And that's kind of what your fingers have to have, is they have to have a mind of their own. You can see there's a cast shadow of the whole snow pile on that dark asphalt, and that explains that dark edge in the lower left. Now I want to mix a warm color, fairly high in value, to lighten the darks on the curb adjacent to that wet driveway that leads back to the train tracks on the right. Well, Jeanette's doing shopping for the holiday feast, so naturally she's taking a little longer than 45 minutes, and that gives me enough time to finish up some final details. But it's fun just contemplating this complicated scene, doing a speed painting from a parked car. I can always use the colored pencils at the end, hit them with a little water to soften them up, and they'll blend into the painting. Hey, there you are.
There you go.
I guess time's up.
I need an unloader, please.
Wouldn't it be cool if there was a full-length instructional video that took this material on complementary colors and ran with it? That's what I'm going to be doing with this series of videos on color in practice. We're going to go through in the first video and look into black and white and complementary colors, and we're going to take them from simple exercises that you can do yourself to actual demonstrations in the field. I think this will be a valuable approach because you can explore the dimensions of it in a safe environment before you actually try to apply them in a painting. So join me for Color in Practice. And now you've arrived at that point of decision. You can watch another video or check out this playlist of similar titles. And then here's the way to get to my website. Here's some people I want to thank. And don't forget to subscribe. Thanks a lot.